Now, when we think of partition, we think of the one that split India and Pakistan. But the actual story is far bigger. In fact, there were not one, not two, but 5 partitions over the 20th century that gave birth to 12 different nations. In this session, we unravel the hidden threads of these seismic events, revealing the untold stories behind the countries that rose from the ruins of the British Empire. For the session, he's a Delhi-raised Scottish historian and an award-winning filmmaker. A Persian and Sanskrit scholar from Oxford, in 2018, he co-founded Project Dastan, a peace-building initiative that reconnects those displaced by the 1947 partition. His debut film, Child of Empire, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and his animated series, Lost Migrations, sold out at BFI. Today, he launches his debut book, Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia, already a #1 bestseller in India and named as one of the best history books of 2025 by The Week. Please put your hands together for Sam Dalrymple. And for the book launch, may I please invite on someone named one of Britain's leading South Asian writers. She's a senior member at Cambridge University and also on this festival's advisory board. Please welcome on stage Soumya Balsari. Now, to invite on our chair for this session, an associate professor of history at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research with a PhD in history from Harvard University. He is the author of Naroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism, which was the recipient of the 2021 Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay Book Prize. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the BBC, the Atlantic, the Hindu, and the Indian Express, bringing modern South Asian history to life. Please give a warm welcome to Dinyar Patel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This is a wonderfully packed audience, and I'm thrilled to be here, particularly with Dinyar, whose book on Naroji is one of the great tomes of on early Indian nationalism. I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with about a half-hour presentation from me, and then we're going to go into conversation before opening up for questions from the audience. So thank you, and yeah, I think we've got the PowerPoint here. Can you all see? Yes. So I wanted to open this session with this image here, this map. There is this kind of thing that I think many of us grow up with, this idea that you can see the Great Wall of China from space. And in fact, you can't. Even if you were to squint your eyes as hard as you could from the International Space Station, you wouldn't be able to see a thing. And that's because there's only one wall that you can see from space, and that's the India-Pakistan border that you can see over here. On the bottom left, you can see Karachi, and on the right-hand side, you can see the cities of Jaisalmer and Bikaner in India. And you can see this long line of fog lights stretching from the Arabian Sea all the way north, about 3,000 kilometers, through the deserts of Thar, through the plains of Punjab, all the way up to just a few kilometers away from the second highest point on planet Earth, K2. And this is one of the most fortified, militarized regions on planet Earth. And it's just one of many, incredibly militarized borders in this region. Of course, this one in particular has kind of nuclear arms on both sides pointing at each other. Just this April, we almost went to war with missiles being lobbed over this wall. But if you were to move just further east, you'd come across the India-Bangladesh border. That is actually the longest wall on planet Earth, the only wall longer than the Great Wall of China. It doesn't actually look it when you see it from kind of space, but it wiggles around the Bengal Delta in such a kind of haphazard way that it's actually more meters of wall than any other wall on planet Earth. And then, of course, if you go further east, you'll reach the India-Myanmar border, which is currently planned to have one of the largest border wall projects, currently being built. So I think since the Myanmar military had its coup a few years ago, the Indian government has announced plans to wall up this border, which is actually a larger bordering project than even the US-Mexico border wall that I think we hear far more about in the news. What's extraordinary about these borders is the fact that if you were to go back 100 years ago today, not one of these borders not only existed, but was foreseen. So 100 years ago, to set the scene, the British Raj is at its height. You've just had the Victoria Memorial opened in Kolkata, this kind of, enormous building, built to resemble St. Paul's Cathedral, but kind of made from the stone of the Taj Mahal, the same marble. And of course, in Delhi, you have the building of Lutyens Delhi underway, which is actually the largest architectural ensemble ever attempted by the British Empire anywhere in the world. And what's extraordinary is that when you can see this in the news. I think we're so used to the story of the kind of growing, the rising Indian nationalism and the gradual decline of the British Raj, that it's extraordinary that in this moment, in 1928, just under 100 years ago today, this is the moment that the Indian National Congress declares its aim as complete national independence. And yet what's extraordinary is you look at the newspapers from the time, and it's actually a minor story that day, because no one in Britain itself, because no one thinks it's ever going to happen, because Britain is so confident in the continuing kind of presence of empire. In fact, the biggest story that day is the fact that the British Empire is about to reach into space and expand into the stars. The biggest news is that the BBC has turned its radios to the stars and is trying to contact aliens for the first time in history. Hello, all stars and nebulae, says the BBC presenter, a greeting to all friendly planets that circle with us on the everlasting tour. Do our waves reach you yet? There's an awkward pause for about 3 minutes, as they kind of wait, hopefully, for some aliens to get in contact with them. And then eventually there's no response. And so instead, the BBC presenter turns to address the people of Britain, and in particular, the people of India, who represent, at that time, 4/5 of the British Empire and a quarter of humanity. And this is the crucial thing that I want to get across in the course of the next kind of half hour or so, is the fact that at this moment, at the moment that the Congress makes its famous demand for Purna Swaraj, India is almost 2.5 times the size of present-day India in ways that we have almost completely forgotten today. There is no better image to demonstrate this than this image on the screen here. This is an Indian Empire passport, because even at the time it was recognized that India was not just one thing. There were millions of princely states in addition to British India. It was an empire within an empire. What we've forgotten is the fact that it stretched far further than we tend to realize. This is a Yemeni Jewish woman from the city of Aden in southern Yemen. The Balfour Declaration has declared Jerusalem, like a homeland for the Jewish people, and to migrate there from Yemen, she has to go on an Indian passport, because by virtue of being born in Yemen, she is legally an Indian citizen. This is the standard list of princely states, the 1/3 of the subcontinent that was not directly ruled by Britain, but that was run by these semi-independent kingdoms, such as Jaipur, Jodhpur, Kashmir, Hyderabad, etc. We forget that the standard list of princely states issued by the British government at the time, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi, and if you go just below Bhopal, you can see the name Bhutan. This is a story that is far larger than we tend to realize. And you can even see it in the photos from the famous Delhi Darbar. Here you have all of these princes, like I think this is Indore, Maharaj of Indore perhaps, who come to basically pay obeisance to the viceroys and to the king and queen of Britain. What we forget is that also there are all the sovereigns of Shan states of Burma, as well as the sultans of eastern Yemen, who are on these elephants behind the Nizam of Hyderabad over here. You put all of this together, and this is the map of India when the Congress demands Purna Swaraj. What happens is that when the East India Company is nationalized in 1858, all the territories that had been conquered or put under treaty relations with the East India Company become legally part of India and are given over to a new government office, the India Office. Sri Lanka had been separated off into a separate crown colony before, in I think 1798. But the map of regions that once had an Indian passport is this. It stretches from the Red Sea, opposite Ethiopia, all the way to the borders of Thailand, containing within it the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Zoroastrian populations on the planet, and about a quarter of humanity. Now, the story that we're going to be talking about today is the story of how 5 partitions over 5 decades, from about 1921 to 1971, tear this world apart, and the story of how one Indian Empire passport turns into 12 passports today. You've got Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. And so the story begins rather unexpectedly in India's largest and richest province, which is Burma. We forget, because of the way that the Myanmar military has taken Burma out of the global economic system and turned it into a kind of pariah state in a perpetual sense of civil war, we forget that it was right at the heart of the global economy in the early 1920s. In 1933, there's an immigration official who says, until recently, New York was the number 1 immigration and emigration port in the world. Today, it is Rangoon. It had overtaken New York, and the Burmese dream essentially overtakes the American dream in the 1930s. And you can see it in just a short walk around Rangoon. I was there in January and was able to walk within about 4 minutes from Southeast Asia's largest synagogue, made up of mostly Kolkata Jews, through the Tamil Hindu Bazaar, past the Chola Dargah, which Chola is the word for Tamil in Burma, and so the Chola Dargah is the Tamil Dargah, and end up at the Armenian church. Now, this mass immigration, which is kind of remembered through songs and stuff, but not really much more. There's kind of, families who've kept cow sway in their cookbooks, etc. And there's songs like Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon, which kind of, recall this moment. But otherwise, it's largely a forgotten story. What's surprising when you read the papers from the time is quite how much the idea of... So after this mass wave of immigration, Burmese people begin to question whether they're being swamped. Rangoon becomes a majority Bengali and Tamil town. And a lot of Burmese politicians begin campaigning to be made into a separate colony so that they can control their immigration, basically. The debates feel weirdly similar to Brexit. What's surprising, though, is how much everywhere, in all newspapers across the board, talk about this separation as not an obvious one. Here is from the Scotsman newspaper. This attitude towards the separation question is indeed one which strikes deep into the very existence of India itself as an entity. If one province breaks loose, no reason can be shown why similar claims made by others should not be granted. And then at the bottom, insofar as Burma is an integral part of the Indian system, she has no greater claim than any other part to a divorce. Again, this is a world that we're so deeply unfamiliar with. You know, this idea that that Burmese peoples could be Indian, and for the separation of Burma to be controversial, and it very much cuts Burmese society through the middle. On the left is this guy Mahatma Uttama, the leading politician of Burma in the 1920s, who's an acolyte of Gandhi's, runs the local chapter of the Indian National Congress, and campaigns fervently for Burma to remain a part of India. Interestingly, he later becomes the head of the Hindu Mahasabha, the only Buddhist to hold the role, and is later replaced by a certain man called Mr. Savarkar. He's Savarkar's predecessor. But he's actually opposed by Gandhi on the right, who, yes, the same year as he's going and doing his Salt March, is campaigning in Rangoon. This is his speech at the local Congress chapter. But Gandhi is very certain that the lands conquered by British imperialism should not just be inherited by India. India is a nation, he argues, that is tied together by a sacred geography called Bharatvarsh. And this is a geography that goes back to 1000 or more BC with the Mahabharata epic. And he argues that after Britain is gone, the state of India should resemble the geographical contours of Bharatvarsh, stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Sindh to Assam, but not including Burma and not including Arabia. And so there's a lot to go into, which we don't have time to go into here, but in the Great Depression, early 1930s, the Wall Street crash, a series of Tamil bankers who'd worked out in Burma. If you've ever been to Chettinad in South India, you'll know these gorgeous teak mansions made from Burmese teak. These are the guys who basically underwrote the Burmese economy. But during the Great Depression, all these farmers default on their loans, and in the course of a decade, the Chettiar community from a specific district in Tamil Nadu becomes saddled with 1/4 of Burmese agricultural land. And in response, these debates over can we ever really feel Indian as Burmese suddenly changes into a much more serious question of our land is being bought up and we need to have sovereignty over our own borders. On April Fool's Day, 1937, the first partition of India carves its way through the landscape, commemorated in these stamps over here. And this fissure dividing the Taj Mahal from the Shwedagon Pagoda perhaps represents the sense of fracture and the ways that these have been forgotten since. A series of anti-immigration politicians take over in Burma afterwards, particularly a guy called U Saw, who later assassinates Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San. He takes over as premier and creates a list of Indian communities who need to be pushed out. Among this group is one called the Rohingya, who spoke a dialect of Bengali, but had been living in Arakan, what became part of Burma, for at least 800 years, possibly over 1,000. And there are so many pogroms against the Indian population that by the time that World War II starts, the Japanese are sweeping through, the British are evacuating from Rangoon. The first great refugee columns, the first great partition refugee crisis occurs. This is a picture, in the course of the next 6 months, 366,000 Indians flee Burma on foot in what's known as the Long March. And this is a photograph that was actually found in a friend's attic in North London This guy on the left would later become the first Sikh model for Moss Broths, the clothing company. But this is the last photograph of the Sikh community of Bordwin in Shan State before they were forced to make this march. Now, around the same time as this first partition, you have increasing discussion that India, the nation of India, should resemble the geography of Bharatvarsh, this sacred Hindu geography dating back over 3 millennia. And so this is, I think, the bit of the book that's gained the most press attention, is the fact that in the subsequent decade, these states, which had been part of the Raj for decades at this point, will be gradually separated off. They had been attached to India in the by Lord Curzon, and you get kind of, the Sultan of Oman going off to Mayo College, becoming more familiar with Urdu than he was with Arabic. These links actually do precede British imperialism, and one of the more extraordinary things that a lot of people don't realize is that the kind of standard dress in a lot of the Gulf states in the 1920s was not the kind of thobe and futas and the kind of, the GCC dress that we associate with the sheikhs of Qatar, etc. today. They're all wearing sherwanis at the time. This is the aristocracy of Yemen in the 1920s. And as this was a part of India, these links brought this kind of cultural fusion. Perhaps the best example of the fusion of cultures is the dish halim. Halim is a Yemeni dish that was brought to the Deccan by the princes of southern Yemen, who had become jagirdars of the Nizam of Hyderabad, and they mix with this Yemeni dish some local Telugu spices and create the dish that we all know and love today. Now, remarkably, the Brits basically tried to hand this whole region over to the government of India, but when, in the 1940s, the British legation in Tehran writes with surprise of the apparent unanimity of government of India officials that they had absolutely no interest in running the Persian Gulf states after Britain was gone. And this is because it was seen as a potential drain on the Indian exchequer after independence. And this is, again, one of these things that has been completely forgotten. This was Dubai at the time. It's before oil is discovered, and the Indian government in waiting basically sees this as potentially, having to spend loads of money on guarding a series of oases on the other side of the Arabian Sea, with no financial benefit to them. So it's a rather extraordinary. But there are legacies that survive from this. Notably, there's the Khimji family of Oman, the man on the right here, who is the first Hindu sheikh in the Arabian Peninsula. He's been recognized as the sheikh of the Al-Banyan community, the Banya community. And on the left, we have Mr. Ambani, who, as many of you may know, was part of this Gujarati community that had long traded with the Gulf long before oil. Now, he moves back to India in the 1950s after spending some years in Aden, in southern Yemen. And during the rising Arab nationalist movement of the 1950s, he basically figures out that all of these Indians are being kicked out or moving away thanks to rising Arab nationalist sentiment. And so he hires this entire generation of Gujarati and Marathi and Hindi-speaking businessmen in Aden who'd been trained in kind of free market capitalism rather than the Nehruvian socialism in India at the time, and in a sense, in one fell swoop, collects the entire kind of, business community of Aden. This later becomes Reliance's first generation of businessmen, going on to become, one of the greatest companies in Indian history. Now, of course, these two moments could have been two of the most important moments in 20th century South Asian history, but they've been almost completely overshadowed by the scale of what happened next. The Great Partition of British India was undoubtedly one of the seminal moments in 20th century history, one which continues to affect how a quarter of the world's population perceives its past, present, and future. I think of all these moments, it's the bit that people here will be most familiar with. But needless to say, there is a demand for a Muslim homeland, interestingly, explicitly based off of the separation of Burma. Ramat Ali Chaudhry, who creates the name Pakistan, justifies the creation of a Muslim state on the basis that if the Burmese are to separate from India, I see no reason why the Muslims of India must also nonetheless be forced into an Indian federation. So the justification for creating Pakistan is interestingly directly inspired by these earlier partitions. In August 1946, the kind of debates around Pakistan movement turned violent in the streets of Kolkata in what's known as Direct Action Day. This is a scene from the first Partition riot, which will soon, of course, spread across India, turning into one of the most bloody conflicts. What I think not a lot of people realize enough, however, is quite how rushed the whole process was. Mountbatten is sent out as the last viceroy of India in March 1947. In June 1947, he announces India will be split into two dominions, India and Pakistan. He'd been given by Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, a year and a half to kind of transfer power, but he decides he's going to do it in 77 days. And so this is an image from, I think, the Hindu newspaper from a month and a half before independence. And what's curious about it is that no one still has any idea where Pakistan or India are going to be. The Hindu assumes, because it's not yet clear that Punjab and Bengal will be partitioned, it assumes that both Delhi and Kolkata will be the two largest cities in Pakistan. And so begins one of the great bureaucratic nightmares of world history. Famously, when these bureaucrats are given tasked with dividing everything from rivers to stationery sets, and after the dust settles, they realize that with all the libraries, the dictionaries A to K had all gone to India, and J to Z had all gone to Pakistan. Perhaps more atrociously was the fate of the Mohenjo-Daro necklace, the greatest find from the Indus Valley civilization at the time, this beautiful necklace with all these stones that were not from the Indian subcontinent. You had jade from China, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, essentially representing in stone the ancient trade networks of Harappa. Now, unsure of who should get this necklace, the bureaucrats decide they're going to snip the 4,500-year-old necklace in half and give an equal number of beads to India and an equal number of beads to Pakistan. So today you can go to the national museums in both Karachi and Delhi, and you'll see a pile of beads on a table with no description telling you that these were once part of the greatest masterpiece of art of ancient Indian civilization. Now, of course, in this moment, it creates the largest forced migration in human history. Between 10 to 15 million people are displaced in the course of a year. And this is a displacement that continues to live with us. I'm sure numerous people in this audience will come from families that have migrated over from Sindh or from Punjab or from what's now Bangladesh. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight, however, and this is what I call the fourth partition, is that when Cyril Radcliffe, this British lawyer, he's brought in, he's never been east of Paris, and he's brought in, suggested by Jinnah, actually, that he may be an impartial arbitrator because of the fact that he's never been east of Paris and knows nothing of Indian politics. Now, of course, tasking him with dividing a quarter of the world's population would have catastrophic consequences. But what I think people don't realize enough is that he's only tasked with dividing British India, the two-thirds of India under British rule. And so this is the map that he essentially draws. And actually 80% of the modern India-Pakistan border and 30% of the modern India-Bangladesh border, which was, of course, East Pakistan at the time, is actually decided in a completely separate fashion by a series of princely states. These 565 princely states that are essentially, the decision of which state to join is largely left up to the local governments and up to India and Pakistan to try and coerce, essentially, these states to join their respective unions. Here's the princes looking absolutely fantastic in these outfits. I particularly like the Maharaja of Baroda, who I just think looks great. But of course, there are numerous conflicts that would emerge from this process because it wouldn't be as clear-cut as initially thought. In Hyderabad, the debates over whether Hyderabad should join India or remain independent will turn immensely violent, first with the Telangana uprising, then with the Razakars, and then later with the Indian Army essentially going in. This whole process leads to 3 times more displacement over the borders of Telangana, essentially, than there is in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. So we very rarely associate partition with South India, but I think we really need to change that because there is 3 times more displacement around Telangana, Karnataka, and Maharashtra than there, and Marathwada, obviously, is the bit of Hyderabad state that becomes part of the modern state of Maharashtra today. There's also the state of Balochistan that was essentially a constitutional monarchy. The question of whether to join Pakistan is put up to the parliament. Parliament says, now we'd rather remain independent, but later the Khan is pressured into joining Pakistan through a series of sort of moments that I discuss in the book. This is the debate that basically sets the foundations for the modern Balochi independence movement that continues to appear in the news every now and again. And then, of course, the princely state that's created the most conflict is Kashmir. This is the rather extraordinary political poster from Srinagar that year. Kashmir defends democracy. So this is, so here the story is that the Hindu Maharaja, Muslim majority state, but with enormous Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist populations as well. Initially, the Maharaja tries to remain independent on the basis that Nepal and Bhutan have just won a legal case to remain independent from the future state of India on the basis that it's a Himalayan state with far more, pre-colonial relationship to Tibet than to India. So the Maharaja of Kashmir tries to do this, but a series of partition massacres in Jammu eventually leads the Pakistani army to begin sponsoring a militia to try and take Kashmir by force. The Maharaja eventually cedes to India in self-defense, and very quickly you have the Indian and Pakistani armies pulled in to a war over the state. And obviously today it remains divided by the line of control, with half of the former state now administered by Pakistan, half administered by India, and this bit actually now administered by China through a completely separate story. The map of the subcontinent by 1949, by the time that the ceasefire over Kashmir is enacted, is largely the one that we recognize today. The biggest difference from the map that we know today is the fact that what's now Bangladesh is still referred to as East Pakistan on maps through the 1950s and 60s. And I think I've just flown in from Dhaka, where I was doing a Dhaka launch, and I think one of the things that often surprises people when they look into the archives, despite these 2 wings being separated by thousands of miles, there is a lot of, and speaking different languages, etc., there is a genuine attempt in the kind of first decade of a united Pakistan to try and bridge this political chasm. 4 of the first 8 prime ministers of Pakistan will be from Bangladesh, from East Pakistan. And this is obviously a coin from the 60s, once the language movement has died down, which features both Urdu and Bangla on it. But everything changes when the military takes over in Pakistan in the late 1950s. And the crucial thing is that the military at this time had only about 2% Bengalis in it. And so what happens is essentially in one fell swoop, the entirety of the Eastern Wing, which was actually more populous, is pushed out of government overnight. Despite there having been many Bengali politicians and civilian politics in the early decade of Pakistan, suddenly there's none. And suddenly you begin to hear talk in the local newspapers that it feels like colonialism's never ended. This man, Mujibur Rahman, would launch a movement for increased Bengali autonomy and potentially a confederation of East and West Pakistan. But when he wins an election in 1971, the military refuses to hand over power and instead launches what's known as Operation Searchlight, basically a movement to arrest or kill many of those associated with his movement. I think that it's important to remember that 1971 rather than 1947, is the year that the modern geopolitical map of South Asia is made. Not only is it the last time that the borders of the subcontinent changed, it's the moment that India is transformed overnight into essentially the undisputed power in South Asia, rather than, a balancing act between India and Pakistan. But also, the scale of displacement that year is extraordinary. The statistics of the number of people killed remains incredibly contested. Bangladesh claims that 3 million Bengalis are killed in the course of a year, whereas Pakistan claims only about 30,000. So huge difference. Basically, both of these statistics are not based on any real methodology or anything. What is certain, and we can say for certain, is that the UN records of the number of refugees fleeing East Pakistan into India and Myanmar that year is 10 million, roughly comparable with the scale of displacement in 1947, but concentrated into what was essentially half of a single province in 1947. So it's an extraordinary scale of suffering that occurs that year. And of course, in December 1971, the Indian army finally makes it to Dhaka, forces through a ceasefire, or a surrender, rather. And in this moment, in this picture, they are signing into existence Bangladesh as the 12th and final nation state to emerge from what was once the Indian Empire. Thank you.
So thanks so much for that, Sam. And I really would like to recommend this book to all of you. I mean, a lot of work has been done on partition. A lot of work has been done on, say, how Burma or parts of Arabia have emerged from the Raj. But this is really the first book that kind of puts all those stories together. I mean, every once in a while you get a book that kind of, forces you to say, aha, there's a bigger story out there than what we conventionally believe. And I think you do a very convincing job of telling how, the story of partition, or partitions, as Sam has put, is one that doesn't, happen in 1947. It's not one that even, stops in 1971. I mean, I think that the one line that really sticks with me most from your book is, toward the end of the book, you say partition is not ended. And I think all of us who, again, have experienced what happened in May of this year can somewhat relate to that, right? I mean, this is an ongoing process. I mean, a very famous book came out a few years ago called The Long Partition, and in some ways, long is a bit of an understatement, right? I mean, it's a process that is very much ongoing. And those of us who are sitting here in Bombay, I mean, we are all kind of privy to these lost connections, right? I mean, many of you will have furniture at home that's made from Burma teak wood. You will live close by to areas called Aidenwala Street, or Aidenwala Compound, or other things called Al-Maskati, places like that. The city of Bombay, up until 47, really kind of looked out westward, right, into the Indian Ocean, and through eastward connections also to places like Burma and Singapore and such, and you get a really strong appreciation from a book like this. So what I want to do is now ask one or two questions to Sam, get in a bit of a conversation, and then turn it over to all of you for your questions. So the first question I want to ask you is, when we think about partition, we think about 1947. And when we think about 1947, we think about Punjab, and rightfully so, right? I mean, it is horrific what takes place in Punjab. But I want to ask you how the story of Punjab in 1947 overshadows this much longer story that you've detailed.
Sure, I think this is really important. So I think that the reason that Punjab overshadows everything is because that's where the violence took place, mostly. And a crucial element that is often overlooked is the fact that Punjab was the epicenter of where the Indian Army recruitment came from, and numerous soldiers had just come back from the war, from World War II, with guns and trained in how to use them, and there was this black market in weapons. So, unlike the partitions riots elsewhere, these were far more deadly because they often had machine guns, and you often hear of the people working in the Punjab Boundary Force that, unlike the partition riots going on in UP or in Madhya Pradesh, etc., these guys had Gatling guns. But what this has overshadowed to some extent is the scale of population transfers that took place across the subcontinent throughout these 5 decades. I think that a lot of amazing new work is being done on this, and I very much don't want to kind of claim that I've discovered this or something. I'm very much the kind of, there's an extraordinary range of scholars doing incredible work, notably the 1947 Partition Archive in Berkeley, which has just put out a book called, I think, 1,000 Voices, which talks about partition migrations from across the subcontinent. And crucially, I think, for one of the first books that really focuses on South India's migration and Madhya Pradesh and the Deccan. But, there's a whole region of Karachi which is Tamil speaking and was, migrants from areas outside of Chennai. Much of, you just have to look at some of the cemeteries in this city to see the communities that lived here in the early 20th century and don't anymore. You mentioned about the way that Bombay looked out to the sea. Rati Jinnah's tomb is about 20 minutes from here. Jinnah's wife is buried about 20 minutes from where we're sitting right now, and his house is 20 minutes in the opposite direction. And so, these are areas that are so connected. But I think particularly, the Gulf states, for example, a lot of the story of this surprises people because I think that the Gulf states themselves have told their history as kind of beginning with oil, and before that there was this kind of timeless moment of sheikhs roaming around the desert in kind of white robes with a falcon on their wrist, and sort of, that was going on back millennia. Part of this is because of the fact that none of the historical documents to do with the Gulf are actually there, and there's this guy called James Onley who wrote an amazing book called The Arabian Frontier and the Raj. He writes how he was basically commissioned by the Qatari royal family to find and digitize documents for on the Gulf for a Qatar digital library, and he was sent to kind of the British Library and to all these other libraries, see whatever they could find on what was going on in the Gulf before oil. And he eventually arrives in Bombay and discovers that the entire pre-oil history is sitting in the local archives here, in the Maharashtra State Archives, because the entire GCC region, the entire GCC Gulf states, were part of the Bombay presidency for about 100 years. And, this is a history that's almost entirely been swept aside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as someone who breathes in the fumes and the dust and the disintegrating paper in that archive, it's quite remarkable to see. I mean, every once in a while, you'll see someone come from the Gulf and do research because this is the place where it is. And, if you want to research Aden, you come here. There's not much really that remains in Aden. If you want to research the history of Oman, you come here. I mean, how strong those relations are is given by the fact that, Oman was part of a large, slave trading empire. And a lot of the slaves who were liberated in the 19th and early 20th century came to Bombay, and some of them were actually educated in Nashik also. So these connections are really strong precisely because, these areas were under the domain of Bombay. So the second question I want to ask you is, looking a little bit beyond the question of longer partitions, but I think another important theme that we can identify in your book is questions of leadership, right? In the sense that, here in India, we tend to blame departition on Jinnah and the Muslim League. In Pakistan, of course, blame is put on the Congress and Gandhi. Everyone blames the British, right? But from your book, one gets a very strong sense that there is a crisis of leadership across the board, right? That there's, there are many opportunities that are given to resolve this in a way that, does not lead to horrific violence, and many of those opportunities are squandered. So I wonder if you can speak to a little bit of how the story of all these partitions is a story of failures in leadership as well.
Yeah, I think one of the extraordinary things about this time period is, I think there is a movement these days to try and avoid the kind of great man histories of, the 19th century, etc., and focus more on kind of, the history of the people affected by these events. But one of the extraordinary things about the Great Partition is how much it is the decisions of a small group of a kind of handful of 5 men, and not women, who are put in charge of, basically determining the fate of a quarter of humanity. And it's extraordinary how many moments that they almost resolve everything, and how much does come down to essentially personal dislike amongst these men. I think that in the early days, we forget that if you were to ask anyone in 1920s India who would be the most likely leader of an independent India, they would have said Jinnah. He was the Indian National Congress's leading person. We never hear about him in the list of freedom fighters today, for obvious reasons, in that he later becomes, the founder of Pakistan. But, Sarojini Naidu in the 1920s is calling him the greatest ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. And he essentially turns away from that position largely thanks to personal disagreements with Gandhi. Crucially, a man born about 100 kilometers away from his hometown in Gujarat. They're both Gujaratis. And they're both lawyers, educated within 10 kilometers from one another in London. And so they, for all intents and purposes, they should have got on in some sense and been much more politically aligned. Mountbatten, likewise, I think we overlook the extent to which Wavell, the last three viceroys, you've got Linlithgow, who is the third last, 1940. He is very much pro-Jinnah and hates the Congress. Wavell, the penultimate leader, is kind of even-handed. And when Mountbatten shows up, he immediately gets on with Nehru and just finds him charming, and they'd met earlier in, I think it was Singapore, and they just had a good rapport. Whereas, in the moment that he meets Jinnah, he just sours and thinks of him as a rather unlikable man. And it's amazing how much this personal dislike changes the politics to a huge degree. And to the extent that there are all sorts of rumors that float around Nehru's relationship with Mrs. Mountbatten, Edwina. We have no kind of camera to know what's going on and what their relationship was actually like. But what we do know is that rumors about their closeness convinces Jinnah to not opt for a joint Governor-General of India and Pakistan for the 2 years after partition. That was the original British plan, that there would be a joint army to overlook the whole process and to be able to deal with any riots, etc. And he pulls away from a joint governorship because of his distrust of Mountbatten, to do with, basically he thinks he's going to be biased because of the Mountbatten and Nehru closeness. So these personal relationships have an enormous impact.
Yeah, I mean, we are living in a moment now where big personalities are back on the stage, right? So I think we have a bit of a flavor of what personality traits or personality whims or fancies can really do to global politics, especially perhaps in the last year or so. It's remarkable when you read accounts like what Sam has written over here about how just small little chance encounters or particular meetings or dynamics between particular personalities lead to a whole constellation of events which creates the world that we live in right now, right? I mean, if you ask about why, say, Bhutan is independent, or why Kashmir is a certain way, or why the border is a certain way in Punjab, a lot of it comes down to personality traits, which, as you rightfully point out, I mean, we need to push back against great man, centered historical accounts, but by completely discarding it, we're at the peril also of taking out a large part of how history works. So, I mean, I think you strike a good balance in your book. So we have about 10 minutes remaining in the session, and we should turn it over to all of you to ask questions. So do we have mics in the audience? Okay, great. We can, if you have a question, raise your hand. And yes, in the back. Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Saloni and greatly appreciate this dialogue and the session we've had. There's been so much of learning as much as unlearning through it all. My question's also inspired by the book cover. Big shout out to Ollie Cameron, I believe, who's your illustrator. And based on that, Sam, you do a lot of primary source of literature, very, very varied. Along with it, there's also cross-cultural testimonies that integrate within your texts. How do you cultivate, sustain, and balance empathy when dealing with the extreme need to have distance when conducting or undertaking a historical analysis, please? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I can very specifically want to thank, in learning how to do this, my great mentor, Anchal Malhotra, who when... she's an amazing oral historian of the partition, and if you haven't read her books, please go do so. I basically came to this subject from, as a university student, I started this group called Project Astan with some Indian and Pakistani friends to try and reconnect families across the divide. And we reached out to Anchal, who essentially sat us down in a cafe when we were all very enthusiastic students with no training whatsoever. She basically said, kind of, you know, if you don't learn how to do this properly, you're going to traumatize people even more. And so then basically became a mentor and gave us quite rigorous oral history training and put us through a quite kind of, you know, taught us how to actually go about this in a professional and thoughtful manner. And there are ways, I think the key thing is listening is the key thing, not searching for them to say a specific thing, and not pushing, allowing people to come up with what they want to, but also not trying to focus on the moments of trauma itself. So I think one of the key things that I learned from Anchal was, you know, like when conducting one of these interviews, you should mainly focus on the events before partition, the memories that, you know, and if someone wants to volunteer the more traumatic elements of 1947, then they can. But basically what you want to do is you want to ask about, you know, life beforehand, you know, how close were you with the other communities? What festivals did you have? What was your school like? These sort of questions. And allow your interviewee to bring up other questions on their own and always have a certain moment of respect so that you're not pushing your own narrative on other people. And I think that advice has done wonders. So yeah, Anchal is amazing. And yeah, for anyone who wants to learn more about oral history, do reach out to her because she's very willing to help young historians and all that kind of thing. Thank you.
Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Kavit Vishnath, and thank you so much for the insightful session. First of all, you have delved deeper into the geographical fragmentation that happened. I just have one particular question with respect to what happened in the Middle East. Though geographic fragmentation happened, the economic fragmentation didn't happen until 1960s. What I've read is that the Gulf rupee was still in use until the 1960s. And it was later discontinued because of a devaluation by the Indian government. So just wanted to know what was the reason that they still adopted the Indian rupee until that time, and what would have been the implications on both sides, Indian as well as the Middle East, if that practice were still in place?
Sure, thank you. I think that in general, the relationship with the Gulf and its gradual collapse between the relationship, and then of course, you know, re-emergence today, the GCC states are some of India's closest trading partners, many of the populations are majority Indian in these states. You know, I think that there wasn't, at the time, these were still protectorates of Britain. When they're separated from India, they are essentially moved from under the purview of the viceroy, and, you know, the list of princely states that kind of Dinyar Patel will later integrate, into just a separate category of protectorates of the British Empire in the colonial department of the British government. But, you know, there still wasn't at the time a growing sense of nationalism. I think in addition to this growing sense, you know, India's devaluation, I think a crucial reason for the adoption of these new currencies was essentially a growing sense of Arab nationalism that sweeps across the region at this time. There's an interesting phenomenon that you very, very clearly see, where in the course of between about 1955 and 1965, each of these states will tie citizenship to a fair knowledge of Arabic, and if you don't know Arabic well, then you're automatically considered an Indian or Pakistani civilian, despite the fact that you may have been living there for generations. Likewise, the currencies were still used, but it's at exactly the same moment of this rising Arab nationalism that they trying to change the name and try to change the currency. Crucially, the Gulf rupee was issued here, but it already was a sort of increasingly separate. It was known as the Gulf rupee, whereas I think what's extraordinary about the 1920s is there wasn't even a Gulf rupee, it was just the rupee. And in the 1920s, the army of the Gulf states was the Indian army. The legal system was the Indian legal system. If you wanted to sue someone in Aden, you often had to take a boat to Bombay because the high court was here. And it's as a result of this, again, that when you go around Colaba today, you'll see so many kind of Kuwaiti and Bahraini shops, etc. That's a direct legacy of these connections. I don't think I know or have read enough about the impacts of that devaluation and the changing of the currencies, but it's undoubtedly a huge moment in that rupture. Yeah, thank you.
So we have time for one more question. Let's see. Yes, over there.
That was really fascinating, I must say. I mean, I learned so much. It was just amazing.
Thanks.
Because I've lived in Saudi and I've lived in India and just had no clue about any of that. I mean, so thank you very much. We look at borders and we tend to think, okay, that's what it is, and it's going to be like that forever. And obviously, it's not. If you look at the borders of Europe or whatever. So this is more about the future, and I'm just wondering. I don't know if this is the right venue, but what do you think is the potential of a South Asian federation? In other words, do you ever think that there's a possibility of evolving towards a point where we could have a sort of EU of South Asia?
Brilliant question, thank you. So firstly, just regarding your time in Saudi, one of the interesting things, so basically the bits of the Arabian Peninsula that were under Indian rule, Indian, of course, British India, but were basically everything with the exception of North Yemen and Saudi. And actually one of the reasons that when Ibn Saud goes to basically unite the tribes of Arabia and create Saudi Arabia, the reason that he doesn't expand into Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, etc., is because they are under the protection of the Indian army. So actually, again, there's a whole Indian story there about why the Saudi border stops where it does. With regard to a South Asian federation, I think that, I would love that. I think many people in this audience would love that. What's extraordinary is how many people in the 1940s thought that that was going to be the case. So I think Nehru talks about a South Asian federation in the not very far future. Aung San Suu Kyi's father in Burma, talks about expecting that as well. And crucially, and I think it's often forgotten, Jinnah never sold his house in Malabar Point because of the fact that he thought that that was going to be the case. Jinnah accepted an agreement with Congress that, which is known as the Cabinet Mission Plan, where basically India, Pakistan were going to be part of a federation, which was going to resemble the kind of a United Kingdom. So just like the United Kingdoms, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they're recognized as separate nations, but not separate nation states. Jinnah had actually seems to have imagined Pakistan as existing within some sort of federal relationship with India as nations, but not nation states. And I go into the book as to why that collapses. Looking to the future, I think, SARC was created for this purpose, but there have just been so many moments when we've got close, when everything's fallen apart. There is continued cross-border sponsorship of terror attacks, etc., which every time we get close to some resolution seem to derail the whole thing. But yes, I'm still hopeful, and a lot of people in these talks have suggested that particularly with the current government here and there, it's less of a chance than ever. I'd like to remind people that everyone that I've spoken to in both countries have said that the closest that anyone came to creating lasting peace over India-Pakistan issues was actually during Vajpayee, the previous BJP Prime Minister's rule, when he very almost, both with Musharraf and Nawaz Sharif, very nearly kind of resolved everything. And then, of course, everything, once again, rogue elements in the army undercut the entire thing and the Kargil War started. But there is hope, and I think that we can create some lasting peace. There is this fundamental difference to this day that Indians and Pakistanis abroad, despite these political tensions, despite the fact that this is, remains one of the nuclear hotspots of the world, whenever you meet people at college in Europe or in America, Indians and Pakistanis will always get on, go to the same parties, listen to the same songs, etc., in a way that, for example, Israelis and Palestinians just won't. And I think that there still is this widespread want for a more normalized relationship, but it's going to rely on basically pulling back cross-border terror sponsorship, etc. But thank you for that question, and I think we're finished. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thanks again, Sam, for an excellent book.
So I think I'll be signing books next door, so do grab a copy, and I'll be there shortly. So thank you for coming.